What would you do if the only person who jumped in to save your child's life wasn't praised, but punished? Imagine, your daughter is drowning, seconds from death, surrounded by millionaires too frozen to act. One teenager dives in, rescues her, and what happens next? He's not thanked. He's fired, humiliated, threatened. But instead of disappearing, he does something no one expects. He quietly begins building the downfall of the very man who tried to erase him. Not with violence, with intelligence, with precision. This isn't just the story of a rescue. It's the story of a reckoning. And the moment you underestimate someone with nothing to lose is the moment you hand them all the power. Stay with us. It began with a splash that silenced the crowd, a ripple that would shatter the illusion of safety and superiority woven tightly around a wealthy estate, where appearances reigned supreme and empathy had long since drowned beneath the polished surface. On that sweltering Saturday afternoon, 40 guests sipped champagne beside an Olympic-sized pool, framed by sculpted hedges and ported marble, their laughter dying as a teenage boy tore through the water toward a sinking girl whose silent cries no one else answered. This wasn't a story about wealth or tragedy, not really. It was about the arrogance of power, the invisibility of the poor, and what happens when someone society deems lesser becomes the catalyst for unraveling the rot beneath the gold. Meet Zeke Moreno, 17 years old, wiry, sharp-eyed, and calm under pressure in a way that unnerved even adults. He wasn't invited to that poolside gathering. Yet when Lila Crestmore's specialized flotation device failed and her body, twisted by cerebral palsy, began slipping under the blue only, Zeke moved. Not one of the hedge fund managers, not the senators, not the socialites in gold heels. Zeke's mother, Ramona, had cleaned the Crestmore estate for 12 years. Zeke knew every inch of it, from the guest wing mosaics to the tech room, no one but the patriarch dared touch. And he knew Lila not as a charity case, but as a friend. While the wealthy gathered for their weekend power games, Zeke and Lila read comics together during Ramona's shifts, decoding stories of underdogs and villains and unlikely heroes. That day, Lila's face had twisted in panic, her arms flailing. Weakly against the betrayal of her equipment, her father nowhere in sight. And Zeke didn't hesitate. His body hit the water like a warning shot. What happened next should have been a triumph, a celebration of instinct, humanity, and courage. But instead, it was the beginning of a calculated war. Because when Zeke pulled Lila from the water and she coughed back life, clinging to him in gratitude, it wasn't the girl's relief that drew attention. It was the glare from Marcus Crestmore, real estate magnate, power broker, and father of the girl whose life had just been saved. The man didn't say thank you. Instead, he demanded, "What are you doing in this area of the estate? This isn't for staff." It wasn't the near death of his daughter that enraged him. It was the perceived trespass of a black boy from the service quarters into the sacred space of the elite. But here's where the narrative pivots. This isn't just about racism or classism. It's about the fatal underestimation of someone with nothing left to lose. Marcus Crestmore had built an empire on intimidation, hush money, and curated optics. What he didn't anticipate was that the boy he humiliated would be the one person capable of dismantling his legacy brick by fraudulent brick. Because Zeke wasn't just a cleaner's son. He was a self-taught coder, a strategic thinker raised on hardship and powered by discipline. He didn't crave revenge, not in the shallow, angry way Marcus imagined. What Zeke craved was clarity, justice, truth, and he was willing to do what no one else in that estate dared: shine a light into the shadows. But first came the retaliation. Within hours of the rescue, Ramona was fired by phone. Marcus didn't even use her name. Just an order: 24 hours to vacate the staff quarters and a threat not to let that boy return. No severance. No thanks. Just silence and shame. The family packed their things by moonlight. No one from the estate intervened. No one asked how Lila felt. The girl's protests were shut down with icy words. You don't understand how the world works. But Zeke? He understood perfectly. He saw it all: the brittle security of the powerful, the paper walls of their empires, and how easily arrogance could be used against itself. That night, Zeke didn't rage. He opened his battered laptop, the one he'd repaired with salvaged parts, and began building something, not a virus, not a smear campaign. Something more elegant, a mosaic of facts, timelines, connections. He didn't just want to burn Marcus Crestmore down. He wanted the truth to do it for him. Zeke didn't sleep that night. While the sun rose over the estate he was no longer welcome at, he sat at their kitchen table, a chipped hand-me-down wobbly from years of use, surrounded by scribbled notes and glowing screens. His mother, Ramona, watched silently, torn between pride and fear. She had scrubbed Marcus Crestmore's imported tiles with devotion, believing that if she worked hard enough, kept her head down long enough, maybe they would be safe. But safety was never real. It had always been conditional. Zeke had understood that for years. He just hadn't told her, not to protect her, but to protect the fragile illusion that decency might still exist within systems designed to erase people like them. He didn't need vengeance. He needed leverage. And he knew where to start. Marcus wasn't just rich. He was careful, paranoid, even. But in his obsessive need for control, he'd made a crucial mistake. He relied on technology he didn't understand. The estate's surveillance system, high-end, custom-rigged, and remotely accessible, was a vulnerability Marcus had created himself. Zeke had seen him using his phone to toggle through camera angles, boasting about being able to see everything. That arrogance was a key, and Zeke, fluent in code, had already picked the lock. But first, he needed to understand the architecture of Marcus Crestmore's empire. Zeke didn't look for the obvious scandals. He went for the details: inconsistencies in property transfers, zoning loopholes, shell corporations with vague names buried in public registries. It wasn't glamorous work. It was granular, exhausting, and required the kind of focus most people couldn't sustain. But Zeke had always been different. While other kids played video games, he reverse-engineered them. While his peers scrolled TikTok, he wrote Python scripts and annotated legal documents. At school, most teachers ignored him except one, Ms. Evelyn Price. A sharp-eyed former journalist turned civics teacher had once exposed a corruption ring that nearly cost her career. Now she taught teenagers about systems most adults didn't understand. She noticed Zeke's questions in class, questions that hinted at a deeper agenda. "You're researching someone," she said after class, her voice low, almost amused. "You've got that look. Who is it?" Zeke hesitated. Then he showed her a folder. Her eyebrows rose. "You compiled all this in a week?" "4 days," he replied. She didn't smile out of pity. She smiled out of respect. That moment marked a shift. Zeke was no longer operating alone. With Miss Price's connections and her old newsroom instincts, they started refining the case. What Zeke brought in data, Evelyn brought in strategy. They weren't gathering evidence for a tweet thread or a YouTube expose. They were building a case airtight enough to interest federal investigators. Meanwhile, back at the Crestmore estate, the atmosphere soured. Lila, confined to her room under the watchful eye of a private nurse, was desperate to make contact. Her father thought isolating her would preserve his version of events. What he didn't understand was that Layla had grown up watching him manipulate narratives. She knew the game, and now she had a reason to play it. With the nurse's help, she called Zeke. "There's a room in the basement," she whispered, "behind the painting of my grandfather. My dad goes there every night. It's locked, but I've seen the keypad code. There's a safe and a wall of screens. I think he's hiding something." Zeke absorbed every word. This was more than circumstantial dirt. This was direct access to the source, and it meant they had less time than he'd hoped. Miss Price introduced Zeke to Theo Ramirez, a civil rights attorney known for going toe-to-toe with powerful men. Ramirez was skeptical until he reviewed the documents. "You're 17, he said, stunned. "And you've done more work than most paid investigators, but we'll need airtight chain of custody. If we're going after someone like Marcus, we have to do it flawlessly." Zeke nodded. "He only sees what he expects, and he never expected me." Across town, Marcus felt untouchable. He doubled down on legal threats, hired private security, smirked during interviews about baseless accusations and bitter staff. He believed in money, not consequences. But as it turns out, even empires rot from the inside, and it only takes one spark to light the dry timber. What Marcus hadn't considered was that while he tightened his control, he was making it easier to monitor. Every threat he issued, every dismissive phone call, every sneer about people like them was recorded, sometimes by the very tech he'd installed to keep others out. Zeke wasn't breaking into systems. He was using the systems Marcus had built. That was the poetry of it all. The first domino fell on a Tuesday, though no one knew it yet. An anonymous tip landed in the inbox of the Eastern Ledger, a respected independent newspaper with a reputation for chasing stories other outlets wouldn't touch. The message was concise, polite, and terrifyingly well documented. A real estate mogul is laundering money through shell companies tied to municipal contracts. You'll want to start with Crestmore Development Holdings. Z.M. Attached were 27 PDF files, a spreadsheet mapping offshore wire transfers, and a drive folder of documents titled Phase 1. Zeke didn't need to say more. His work spoke for itself. By that afternoon, an investigative editor had flagged the lead to their legal team. By Wednesday, reporters were digging into public filings. Marcus Crestmore's name, once protected by wealth and favor, was now on the tongues of people who didn't owe him anything. And yet, he still had no idea the walls were closing in. That was the brilliance of Zeke's plan. Marcus believed enemies announced themselves with rage. He didn't recognize the enemy who moved in silence. While the media fanned the first flames, Zeke kept building. It wasn't just about proving financial fraud. It was about exposing character, patterns, hypocrisy. Every eviction Crestmore Properties had pushed through in underserved neighborhoods. Every bribery whisper from subcontractors. Every former employee buried under an NDA. Zeke compiled them all. He wasn't creating a headline. He was crafting a narrative. A story that would be undeniable once the public had all the pieces. Meanwhile, Lila, still monitored but increasingly resourceful, began secretly forwarding emails to Zeke from her father's tablet. One included a contract, backdated, unsigned, for a massive city redevelopment project no one had publicly announced. He said it was just between trusted friends for now. She told Zeke over a secure call. But the land is near a school. If that goes through, people will be displaced. Families. That tipped everything. This wasn't just corruption. It was harm, displacement, erasure. Zeke printed the documents and added them to the now fat folder labeled simply Proof. Ms. Price, now fully embedded in the mission, connected Zeke with an ally in the district attorney's office, a junior prosecutor named Sanaa Blake, who had grown up just blocks from Zeke's neighborhood. I can't move officially until we get first-hand testimony or hard surveillance, she warned. But this could change everything, Zeke nodded. I'm working on it. Because what Marcus didn't know, what he had never considered, was that Lila wasn't just a loose end. She was a witness, a victim, and worse for him, a daughter with her own mind. The next leak hit harder. A transcript of a phone call between Marcus and his legal counsel where he casually discussed discrediting the cleaning lady's kid and possibly offering a little hush money if the boy gets mouthy. The phrasing was cruel, flippant, and deeply recorded. Thanks to a vulnerability Zeke had quietly exploited weeks earlier, audio routed through the mansion's smart hub, speakers, microphones, home controls could be mirrored to a cloud. Account Marcus didn't know existed. Zeke hadn't hacked anything. He had simply listened. For days, weeks, and when it was time, he curated the worst of it. He didn't doctor anything, didn't embellish, just revealed. And the world listened. The media firestorm began on a Thursday. Headlines screamed from every corner of the internet. Developer accused of exploiting public contracts. Whistleblower links Crestmore empire to fraud ring. Leaked audio reveals shocking statements about disabled daughter and fired housekeeper. Marcus's phone rang every 5 minutes. His lawyers, his PR team, his investors. It's a hit job, he growled. They're targeting me because I'm successful. But no amount of spin could reframe the audio, especially the part where he referred to his daughter as a liability I can't control anymore. Lila heard it. And when she did, something inside her shifted permanently. Her whole life, she'd watched her father manipulate perception, twist truth, use her as a prop for sympathy or virtue when it suited him. But now she saw clearly, he wasn't cruel just in moments. He was cruel by design. With Rosa, the nurse's help, Lila recorded her own message, a short video explaining what had happened, how Zeke had saved her life, and how her father had tried to erase the truth. He didn't thank Zeke, she said quietly. He punished him, and he punished me for knowing better. They uploaded the clip anonymously. It went viral in 6 hours. By Friday morning, the gates of the Crestmore estate were flanked not by private guards in pressed uniforms, but by reporters, camera crews, and drones that hovered like vultures circling a crumbling dynasty. Marcus Crestmore, once the unquestioned master of his domain, now looked out his bay windows and saw only chaos. His empire had not collapsed yet, but its foundation had cracked, and cracks, Zeke knew, never sealed themselves. Inside their modest apartment, Zeke sipped cold coffee and reviewed the dozens of emails flooding into the burner address he'd used for leaks. Former contractors, ex-staff, tenants wrongfully evicted by Crestmore Development, all willing to talk, all with receipts. "This is it," Miss Price said, peering over his shoulder. "The dam's broken. You're not alone anymore." But Zeke didn't smile. Not yet, because the most dangerous part wasn't proving Marcus corrupt. That part was nearly complete. The real risk came after. When powerful men lose control, they don't surrender. They strike, and Marcus was striking already. He'd hired a cybersecurity firm to trace the leaks. He had lawyers drafting cease and desist letters, calling in favors with media outlets and political donors. "Smear the boy," he told his PR team. "Make him look unstable. Threaten his mother's immigration status if you have to." But it was too late. That tactic, fear, had already failed. Because Zeke didn't operate on fear. He operated on evidence. And that evidence now sat in a locked folder, backed up across 3 cloud servers, on a timeline scheduled to auto-release should anything happen to him. His insurance policy wasn't muscle or money. It was transparency. That weekend, federal agents began conducting preliminary interviews under sealed records. Sanaa Blake, the junior prosecutor, confirmed what Zeke had hoped for but didn't dare believe. The case was officially in motion. "We're not just looking at fraud anymore," she said during a hushed meeting. "We're looking at conspiracy, tax evasion, and potential witness intimidation. If the safe in that basement contains what we think it does, it's over." But getting into that room legally would take time, and time was running short, because Marcus wasn't just reacting. He was preparing for war. Rumors swirled that he was liquidating assets, transferring funds offshore, even shopping for properties in Dubai. He hadn't fled yet, but he was ready, which meant Zeke had to move first. That's when Lila made her final move. In a moment of quiet defiance, she convinced Rosa, the nurse who had become more like a sister, to help her one last time. They waited until Marcus was at a board meeting downtown. Then Lila wheeled herself into his office, turned on speakerphone, and called Zeke. "You've got 10 minutes, she whispered. "I've disabled the alarm pad. Go now." Zeke didn't hesitate. He and Miss Price drove straight to the estate's rear service road, disguised as delivery personnel, slipping past a distracted guard. Down into the basement they went, and there, behind the grandfather portrait just as Lila had described, was the steel-faced safe. It was old, mechanical, not digital. But Zeke had seen it before, years ago, when helping his mother polish the office brass. He'd watched Marcus punch in the code absent-mindedly while on a call, 1945, the year his company claimed it was founded. The dial clicked, the safe opened, and inside were exactly what they feared and hoped: hard drives, contracts, ledger books, and, most shockingly, photographs. Evidence of illicit meetings with politicians. Bundles of unregistered cash. Signed documents that connected shell companies to fraudulent bids on city contracts. Miss Price looked pale. "We need to go," she said, her voice trembling for the first time. "Now." That night, they digitized everything. By Monday, the FBI had it all. By Tuesday, Marcus Crestmore's life as he knew it was over. The raid happened at dawn. Helicopters, armed agents, screaming headlines. Lila, watching from her window, felt something release in her chest. Not relief exactly, but something close to freedom. Marcus was taken into custody on charges that would multiply in the coming weeks. The public narrative turned vicious. News anchors replayed his voice, cold, dismissive, cruel, alongside images of Zeke escorting Lila from the pool, soaked and silent. And for the first time, the nation didn't just see a villain brought down. They saw a boy rise. Marcus Crestmore didn't say a word as federal agents led him past the news cameras. He wore a charcoal suit, unbuttoned at the collar, as if trying to signal control he no longer had. His expression wasn't shock, it was insult. As if the very idea of being arrested was an inconvenience, not a reckoning. The press had a field day. Terms like fraud magnate, empire of exploitation, and corporate tyrant rotated in headlines, but what stuck wasn't the allegations. It was the audio. Clips of his voice, mocking Lila, threatening Zeke, referring to Ramona as replaceable labor. Those weren't deniable. They weren't theories. They were truths, immortalized in cold digital fidelity. The soundbites echoed across every platform. For the first time, the public heard the interior of power, the unfiltered contempt behind the philanthropy speeches, the charity galas, the photos with local leaders. His image, once untouchable, had shattered. And behind that collapse stood Zeke, not gloating, not even speaking, not yet. Just standing back as the world caught up to what he'd always seen. In their small apartment, Ramona clutched a warm mug of tea and stared at the television, her eyes wet. She wasn't crying because Marcus had fallen. She was crying because her son, her quiet, brilliant, underestimated son, had not only survived injustice but transformed it. "You were never meant to be invisible," she whispered, voice trembling. "You were just waiting for the world to open its eyes." Zeke nodded but said nothing, because he knew this wasn't victory. Not yet. It was exposure. And exposure only mattered if it led to change. In the days that followed, Marcus's attorneys tried every defense, faulty recordings, misinterpreted contracts, political sabotage, but none held. The evidence was too clean, the trail too carefully constructed. Even prosecutors were stunned by the precision. Behind closed doors, one investigator reportedly said, "Whoever built this case isn't just smart, they're surgical." That compliment made its way to Sanaa Blake, who relayed it to Zeke during a late-night call. "They're asking who you are," she said, half laughing. "Some of them think you're part of a nonprofit, or ex-military, or some cyber intel unit." Zeke smiled faintly. "Just a student," he replied. But that was no longer entirely true. Colleges began reaching out. Ivy League names, tech institutes, social justice programs. They didn't just want to admit him, they wanted to redesign programs around his approach. Ms. Price, always pragmatic, coached him through every call. "This is your moment," she told him. "But don't chase prestige. Choose a place where your purpose can grow, not just your resume." Lila, meanwhile, had been placed temporarily with a state-appointed caregiver while investigators reviewed her family environment. She requested only one thing, that Zeke be allowed to help with her tutoring. "He's the only person who ever spoke to me like I wasn't broken," she told the caseworker. "He never treated me like a prop or a problem." That testimony made it into court records. So did dozens of others, from ex-employees, tenants, whistleblowers, all echoing the same truth. Marcus Crestmore had built power by controlling perception, silencing dissent, and weaponizing wealth. And now that those weapons were gone, what was left was a man incapable of accountability. But what most surprised the public wasn't his downfall. It was the boy who brought it all to light. Zeke's story spread like wildfire. Articles called him the teen who dismantled a dynasty, the digital David, and America's quiet hero. Interviews were requested. Networks called. Publishers sent contracts. But Zeke turned most of it down. Not out of pride. Out of clarity. This was never about attention, he told Miss Price. It was about principle. Still, a few appearances were necessary. A short-form interview with The Atlantic went viral after he answered a question about revenge. "People think I wanted to destroy Marcus Crestmore," he said calmly. "But I didn't. I just wanted him to be seen for who he really was. That was enough." The quote hit a nerve. In a culture addicted to punishment, Zeke offered something deeper, revelation. And in doing so, he shifted the conversation from rage to reform. By the second week of Marcus Crestmore's arrest, the story had outgrown the man himself. What began as a scandal was now a nationwide conversation, not just about one magnate's collapse, but about the ecosystem that allowed him to thrive for so long without consequence. People began asking questions they'd never dared ask before. How many other Marcuses are still untouched? How many Zekes have been silenced before their voices could be heard? Across university campuses, civic organizations, and digital forums, the phrase Crestmore effect began trending, shorthand for the cultural whiplash of seeing privilege unmasked by the persistence of someone once deemed disposable. Zeke didn't revel in the attention, but he did recognize the moment for what it was, a window. A short, rare window where the public was paying attention and willing to learn. So he took the interviews he needed to take, not to tell his story, but to make space for others. On one live stream viewed over 3 million times, he said, "I didn't take Marcus Crestmore down. He did that himself. I just refused to look away. And I'm asking you now, don't look away when it's your turn." That quote made it onto T-shirts, onto murals, onto the mouths of teenagers who finally saw someone like themselves not only fight back, but win. But while Zeke was becoming a symbol, he never stopped being himself. Quiet, analytical, grounded. Miss Price often joked, "You've become famous for dismantling power. Don't let power remake you in its image." And Zeke never forgot it. He still rode the city bus, still brought his own tea bags to campus meetings, still called home every night to check on his mother. Speaking of Ramona, she too was changing. For years, she'd moved through life like a shadow, polite, efficient, invisible. But now she walked with her head high. She started her own small cleaning company, not as a maid, but as a business owner. She hired women from the neighborhood, paid them fairly, trained them, protected them. "My son taught me," she told a local journalist, "that dignity isn't given. It's reclaimed." Meanwhile, Lila found her own voice, living with a gentle, advocacy-minded foster family while her father awaited trial, She began speaking at schools about accessibility, medical neglect, and the silent ways children with disabilities are turned into tools by the very people who should protect them. "I was never broken," she said in one speech. "I was just used. But I've stopped letting others speak for me." That speech earned a standing ovation. And it wasn't long before Lila and Zeke began collaborating. Again, not just on schoolwork, but on a digital platform they co-designed. Its goal? To help young people report abuses, identify predatory practices in education and housing, and build secure digital trails when they're too scared to go public alone. They called it Threadlight, a reference to weaving safety into dark spaces. Within months, thousands had signed up, donations poured in. What Zeke had begun in secrecy was now a movement, one that others could carry forward long after his name stopped trending. But of course, not everyone was celebrating. Marcus Crestmore's lawyers tried and failed to suppress evidence, delay trials, and cast doubt on witness credibility. They claimed Zeke had manipulated data, that recordings were taken out of context, but the context had already arrived. It was on every screen, in every living room, in every corner of a society that had for too long confused wealth with wisdom. The jury saw through it. So did the judge. On sentencing day, the courtroom was packed. Zeke sat quietly with Ramona on one side and Miss Price on the other. Lila entered, wearing a navy dress and a steel expression. Marcus was found guilty on multiple counts: fraud, conspiracy, obstruction, intimidation. He was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, no parole for the first decade, no special accommodations, no immunity deals, just consequence. Real, long overdue consequence. But what broke the internet wasn't the verdict, it was the note. A handwritten letter found in Marcus's jail cell during routine inspection, never mailed. Addressed simply, "To the boy I underestimated." In it, he wrote, "I thought power would protect me. I thought money could silence truth. But I forgot that intelligence, when paired with principle, is more dangerous than any fortune. I didn't just lose. I handed you the match." He signed it, Marcus Crestmore, former everything. In the months following Marcus Crestmore's sentencing, the story refused to fade. Not because of spectacle, but because of impact. Zeke Moreno's name became synonymous with accountability without vengeance, courage without spectacle, and brilliance born not in privilege but in pressure. And institutions noticed. Prestigious universities, the kind that once wouldn't have looked twice at a kid from his zip code, began reaching out, not just offering admission, but flexibility. MIT, Harvard, Stanford, all invited Zeke to define the terms of his education, not just as a student, but as a case study. "You didn't just learn outside the system," said one admissions director. "You revealed where the system itself is broken." In the end, Zeke chose Harvard, not for the name, but for a very specific reason. They offered him a dual track in computer science and digital ethics, a hybrid program they built in response to his work. He was the prototype, and he knew it. During orientation, a professor asked what he hoped to accomplish with his degree. "I don't want to be an example," Zeke said. "I want to be a multiplier." That quote ended up on the cover of the school's alumni magazine before he'd even finished his first semester. Meanwhile, Threadlight, the platform Zeke and Lila co-created, became more than a project. it became a sanctuary. Whistleblowers, victims, students, single parents, people who didn't have the luxury of lawyers or press contacts. They started using the app to catalog violations, gather receipts, and connect with support. In less than a year, Threadlight helped expose 3 separate school-to-prison pipeline schemes, a real estate racket displacing low-income veterans, and a fraudulent nonprofit siphoning city funds. All because of a project started by 2 teenagers who refused to be silenced. Lila, now living with a permanent adoptive family who embraced her intellect and independence, thrived. She traveled, spoke, became a voice for disability advocacy, pushing for school reforms that would make adaptive technology a right, not a luxury. "I used to think silence kept me safe," she said at a TEDx youth talk, "but it only kept others comfortable. Zeke showed me that discomfort is sometimes the only way truth gets in." That clip reached 500,000 views in one weekend. Zeke watched it from his dorm, smiling softly. He didn't need credit. He needed results. He spent his college nights not at parties or games, but coding, advising, mentoring, working with legal clinics on digital rights, helping young activists secure their online trails. He had turned his own story into a blueprint for others to follow, but also to improve. "Don't do what I did," he said during a campus panel. "Do it better. Do it safer. Do it sooner." Professors began assigning the Moreno method in journalism and ethics courses. One syllabus listed it under a new module, Disruptive Truth Engineering. And while most students studied the story from the outside, a few sat beside Zeke in class, awed, respectful, and challenged. "You don't act like someone who brought down a billionaire," one peer once joked. Zeke shrugged. "That was the easy part," he said. "Now I have to help rebuild what he broke." Back home, Ramona became a quiet force in her own right. She expanded her cleaning business, hired more women, offered child care, and even lobbied for fair labor protections at city council meetings. When asked by a reporter what changed her, she said simply, "My son reminded me I wasn't born to serve, I was born to lead." Her words landed differently. Not loud, not angry, just undeniable. Meanwhile, the city that once bowed to Marcus Crestmore now bore no trace of his name. His properties were seized, his name stripped from buildings, his awards revoked. But the real shift wasn't what vanished. It was what rose in its place. Community centers, legal literacy workshops, digital clinics, many funded by Anonymous. Donations funneled quietly through the university's ethics endowment. Zeke never confirmed where the money came from, but everyone suspected, and no one questioned it. 3 years after that fateful afternoon at the Crestmore estate, the world had changed, not in headlines, but in echoes. In classrooms, legal clinics, youth centers, and forums across the country, the name Zeke Moreno no longer prompted just admiration. It prompted action. Teachers used his case to teach systems thinking. Social workers cited his approach to digital safety. Young people in overlooked communities began asking themselves not, "Can I fight this?" but what tools would Zeke use? His story had become something more than inspiration. It had become infrastructure. And yet, Zeke himself remained strikingly grounded. By the time he reached his senior year at Harvard, he was co-authoring policy briefs on ethical surveillance, assisting in curriculum design for social justice programming, and quietly mentoring young coders through encrypted forums. His day planner looked like something out of a think tank, but his focus never drifted from where it started, the belief that systems aren't just broken by accident. They're designed that way. And if they can be designed to oppress, they can also be re-engineered to liberate. That's what he did, day by day. Re-engineer. Not with grandstanding or martyrdom, but with elegant code, with quiet partnerships, with deliberate legacy. Revenge is temporary, he said once in a guest lecture. But justice? Justice scales. It wasn't just rhetoric. His actions proved it. By 21, Zeke had already helped 5 low-income students build their own watchdog tools, mini threadlights, tailored for their schools, cities, or causes. One tracked school budget discrepancies. One flagged unfair tenant evictions. Another translated legalese into plain language for communities where English wasn't the first language. These weren't startups. They weren't monetized. They were gifts. Tools for people like his mother, who had once been threatened with silence. Speaking of Ramona, she had expanded her company across 2 cities, now employing over 40 women and 2 single fathers. She offered tuition assistance for their kids, gave paid leave. "We clean homes," she told a local magazine, "but we're really cleaning legacy, washing off what people once told us we couldn't be." And then there was Lila, no longer the girl in the water, no longer the victim in the news clips. At 19, she had become a national voice for inclusive education and disability justice. She appeared before Congress in a wheelchair she'd custom designed. With the help of engineering students from MIT, when asked if she felt proud to have been part of such a famous story, she smiled gently. "I wasn't part of his story," she said. "He was part of mine. Because Zeke didn't save me once. He saved me every time he treated me like a person, not a symbol. And every time since, we've been saving each other, with truth." Her testimony was broadcast live. The applause didn't stop for over 2 minutes. Back at Harvard, Zeke sat quietly watching the feed on his laptop. He didn't smile for the cameras, but he did let a single tear roll down, unseen. That moment, unscripted, unpublicized, might have been the truest reflection of everything he'd built. Not revenge, not dominance, but a life lived with deliberate integrity. At graduation, Zeke was invited to give the closing address, not because he had the best GPA, though it was among the highest, but because his name had become synonymous with transformation, not just of systems, but of self. Standing at the podium in front of thousands, cap tilted back slightly, he didn't begin with a quote or a speech. He began with a confession. "I used to think legacy was something you inherited," he said. "But I know now, legacy is what you interrupt. Legacy is what you rebuild when someone tells you to stay quiet. Legacy is choosing to use pain as blueprints." That sentence reverberated across the audience. Some cried. Others sat frozen, hanging on every word. "When I was 17, he continued, a man told me I didn't know my place. He was right. I didn't, because my place isn't defined by my zip code, or my skin color, or my mother's job title. My place is wherever. Truth needs a witness, and so is yours." 6 months after graduation, Zeke received a letter, not an email, not a message request, but a real envelope, hand-addressed, with no return address. Inside was a single page. Carefully written, measured. It wasn't from Marcus Crestmore. It was from a fellow inmate. "You don't know me," it began, "but I shared a cell with the man you brought down. I need you to know something. He used to talk about you when the lights went out, not with anger, but with disbelief. Like he still couldn't fathom how a kid could dismantle everything he built, not with violence, not with lies, but with truth. I just wanted to say, you changed more than one life. Some of us in here, we were watching." Zeke folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of how wide change ripples when it's rooted in truth. His story had never been about one villain. It had been about what happens when courage refuses to apologize for existing in the wrong skin, on the wrong street, with the wrong bank balance. And now, across cities and towns, that courage had found new voices. One in a 9th grade girl who launched a school blog to track discriminatory suspensions. One in a janitor who exposed a contractor skimming wages off immigrant laborers. One in a wheelchair-bound high school student who pushed for ramps and inclusion, quoting Lila by name. Zeke didn't need to know them all. He just needed to keep the path clear. That's what he focused on now. Not celebrity, not capital, but clearing pathways for others to see what he once had to learn the hard way, that systems of power only stay intact if no one tests the bolts. And the bolts are always looser than they look. He traveled less now, taught more, quietly consulted for nonprofits, developed back-end tools that made whistleblower platforms safer, leaner, harder to trace. He didn't seek headlines anymore. He made them unnecessary. In his first year out of college, he declined offers from the biggest firms in Silicon Valley, not because he didn't need the money, but because he knew their model: praise the disruptor, then neuter his impact by folding him into the machine. He wouldn't be folded. Instead, he partnered with grassroots organizers, helped build infrastructure where no venture capitalist would look. In one small southern town, he helped a group of teens document environmental violations near their school. In another, he trained single mothers in how to encrypt legal documents before presenting evidence in court. These weren't headlines, but they were revolutions, silent, strategic ones. One afternoon, during a panel at a community tech summit, a middle-aged man stood during Q&A. He wore worn boots and a shy smile. "My daughter dropped out 2 years ago," he said. "She thought there was no place for her in this world. Then she watched your story. And now she's back in school, says she's gonna study forensic coding." He paused, swallowed hard. "I guess I just wanted to say thanks." Zeke didn't respond with a speech. He just nodded. A small gesture, but loaded, because he knew for every Marcus Crestmore, there were 1,000 young people waiting to believe that power didn't always win. And his job wasn't to be the hero. His job was to be the doorframe, the opening, the proof that silence can become signal. That pain can become programming. That erasure can become legacy. And slowly, that's what happened. His name began showing up in textbooks, in podcasts, in scholarship prompts. Describe how Zeke Moreno's case impacted your understanding of digital activism. Professors built entire seminars around his methodology, not to worship him, but to translate his work into tools. He became the rarest kind of figure, not mythologized, but operationalized, a blueprint. a user manual for how to fight with. Facts, not fire. And still, when people asked him how he'd describe his journey, he never used big words. It wasn't a rise, he'd say. It was a repair. The truth is, Zeke Moreno never set out to be a symbol. Symbols are for posters, statues, slogans. He never wanted to be frozen in bronze or flattened into a headline. He wanted something harder, something quieter, something that endured. Momentum, because symbols fade. But momentum, when passed down properly, becomes a generational language. One night, as rain tapped gently against his apartment window, Zeke opened a notebook, not a screen, not a document, but real paper, and began writing down the names of people who had helped him build that momentum. Ramona, not just as his mother, but as the first person who taught him the code of humility, of diligence, of survival without apology. Miss Evelyn Price, the woman who saw past the hoodie and the quiet defiance to the strategist beneath. Sanaa Blake, who gave his case institutional teeth when all he had were puzzle pieces and late-night hypotheses. Lila, who had every reason to retreat, but chose to fight with her voice, with her intellect, with her refusal to be pitied. He stared at the list for a long time. Then below it, he wrote one more name. His own. Because it had taken him years to realize that acknowledging your own role in your story isn't arrogance, it's accountability. He had made choices, and he had paid prices. But he had never compromised. And in a world that constantly asked him to delude himself to be palatable, to be quiet, to be grateful, to be non-threatening, Zeke had remained intact, unfolded, sharp, soft, whole. That realization didn't make him invincible. It just made him clear. And clarity was more powerful than fear. In that same notebook, he began sketching a new idea, not a platform, not a case, but a curriculum. A learning model for schools that had no tech departments. A civic curriculum that merged coding, ethics, and storytelling. Not to make kids smarter, but to make them impossible to erase. He called it Signal School. Its tagline was simple: teach them to detect, then teach them to disrupt. Within a year, 5 Title I schools had piloted the program. Within 3, it was implemented statewide in 2 districts. And it didn't take long before alumni of Signal School, kids once labeled at risk, were showing up in places no one expected. A courtroom intern who cracked a payroll laundering scheme. A college freshman who wrote a browser extension that translated legislative language into 8th grade reading level. A community organizer who built an AI model to track racial bias in traffic stops. These weren't just kids. These were Signal carriers, and Zeke knew this was the real win. Not the court case, not the viral moment, but this replication. Tools passed forward. Quiet revolutions coded in basements and back rooms and library corners. Tools that didn't need his face to work. And just like that, Zeke became what he always hoped to be: unnecessary. Because if a movement needs one name to survive, it isn't a movement. It's a brand. Zeke had built something better. Something portable. Something scalable. And he didn't need to lead it anymore. He just needed to stay available when needed and out of the way when not. That balance was the final test of legacy. Not dominance, but design. Some legacies are loud, fireworks, headlines, billboards. But the most powerful ones are silent, measured in the choices people make when no one's watching. That was where Zeke Moreno now lived, in the quiet. Not isolation, but intentional. Distance. He no longer needed proximity to attention. He needed clarity. He lived modestly in a city apartment above a used bookstore. No plaque on the door. No press releases. Just routine. Wake early, stretch, code, mentor, teach, and once a week, walk down the block to visit a small community center that had once been an abandoned mechanic shop. It was now the Threadlight Foundation, not a monument, a hub, a digital justice incubator. Inside were teens with ideas bigger than the room. One wanted to map predatory housing zones. Another was prototyping a trauma-free reporting system for sexual assault victims. Zeke didn't lead. He facilitated. He made coffee. He rebooted routers. He answered the hard questions without ever making himself the answer. He knew that's what made the difference. Power doesn't live in answers. It lives in who gets to ask the questions. On one particular Tuesday, after a long workshop with 3 high schoolers building a wage theft alert system, a volunteer asked him, "Do you ever miss the spotlight?" Zeke paused, thoughtful, then smiled. "No," he said. "I never lived there. I just passed through, and that was the truth." The attention had been a moment. What came after was the work. The invisible, unglamorous, sustained work. But that work? It had changed everything, in places Zeke would never visit. In lives he would never know. In laws rewritten because teenagers now had data to challenge them. In courtrooms where tech evidence built on his model gave voice to people who had never been believed. Even in prisons where men who had once scoffed at that kid now quoted his interviews like scripture, trying to see if they could reroute what was left of their lives. And as for Lila, she was thriving, studying political science and bioethics, still advocating, still brilliant. She once texted Zeke late, "At night, they keep calling us brave. I just call us unwilling." He smiled at that, because she was right. Bravery suggests choice. But for people like them, the alternative to fighting back wasn't comfort. It was disappearance. And neither of them had ever agreed to vanish, not even for a second. As autumn settled in, Zeke began outlining a book. Not a memoir, but a guide. Not about his story, about how to build your own. Its working title was Proof of Life: How to Survive Systems Built to Erase You. It wasn't filled with platitudes. It was filled with frameworks, legal tips, digital protection tactics, social navigation codes, annotated with humor, powered by pain, softened by hope. The world won't always love you for being right. Read the first line. But if you stay ready, they won't be able to ignore you either. That sentence set the tone. Honest, fierce, useful, and above all, transferable. He didn't want people to quote him. He wanted them to outgrow him, to do more, to reach further, to win louder. As the seasons turned, Zeke began to understand something that no courtroom or lecture hall could have taught him. That peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's the presence of purpose. And his purpose, now more than ever, was to ensure that what he built outlasted his own story. He didn't want to be remembered. He wanted people to remember themselves, their power, their worth, their right to question everything. One morning, While walking through the Threadlight Foundation's library, a reclaimed garage now lined with old laptops and printouts of open-source code, Zeke noticed a small group of kids huddled around a projector. They were dissecting city budget files, laughing as they found misspent funds. One of them turned and asked, "Wait, Mr. Moreno, is it true they tried to sue you back then?" Zeke smiled. "Yeah," he said. "They tried a lot of things. It didn't work." The room broke into grins, not because they were impressed, but because they saw it now. Institutions weren't made of stone. They were made of decisions, and decisions can be changed. Later that afternoon, he received an invitation, not from a school or a nonprofit or a university, from the Office of Civic Technology under a new federal initiative called Project SafeNet. They wanted him to advise on a nationwide youth data protection standard. Zeke didn't say yes immediately. He never did. He reviewed the charter, traced its funding streams, cross-checked the language for loopholes, and only when he was certain it wasn't performance did he agree. But he had one condition: you bring youth to the table, not just as guests, as architects. They agreed, because by now they knew Zeke didn't bend, he blueprint-ed. And if he was involved, it was going to be done right. A month later, in a government boardroom usually reserved for lobbyists and consultants, Zeke sat at a long table beside 3 teenagers, all under 18, explaining why data sovereignty is a civil right. One wore sneakers with flashing solace. One had autism and spoke through a device. One had just learned English 2 years ago. They didn't sound like politicians, but they sounded like the future. And Zeke sat back and watched as they took the floor. That moment, quiet as it was, may have been his proudest, because it was working. The pipeline was alive. The path was open. He'd handed off the torch, and they weren't just holding it. They were wielding it. Meanwhile, on the home front, Ramona had started a mentorship program of her own, this time for women leaving domestic labor jobs to start businesses. She called it La Escalera, the ladder. "We don't rise by luck," she told her mentees. "We rise by building steps." And her steps were changing lives. Lila published her first book, Frames, a hybrid memoir and disability manifesto. It hit the bestseller list within a week. But it wasn't fame that moved her. It was how many young readers said it gave them language for what they'd always felt. I am not defective. The system is, she and Zeke still spoke often. Sometimes about projects, sometimes about books, sometimes about nothing at all, but always as equals, always as people who had seen the worst in others and chosen not to become it. In an interview, Zeke once said, "It's not enough to escape fire. You have to learn to carry water back." And he did. Again and again. Not to extinguish all the world's burns, but to remind others, healing is contagious too. Years later, long after the Crestmore name had faded into a cautionary tale and the initial headlines were buried under newer scandals, the story of Zeke Moreno still lived on, not in trending tags or awards, but in the quiet transformations no one tracked. In a rural library where kids learned to protect their data. In a courtroom where a judge cited the Threadlight method to justify accepting anonymized evidence from a teen whistleblower. In a university where Signal School's model became a core curriculum in digital justice studies. But more than that, It lived in the daily rituals of people who used to believe they had no power. Ramona still took the bus some mornings, not because she needed to, but because it reminded her where she started. She often carried a thermos of tea and a worn folder filled with handwritten applications from women who wanted to join La Escalera. One day, while walking home, she passed the old Cressmore estate. The property had changed hands twice. The marble pool was gone. The garden had been turned into a public park. She paused at the gate, just stood there, silent, not angry, not nostalgic, just aware. "You don't win," she whispered, "by getting back inside. You win by building something better outside." Then she walked on. That same month, Zeke was invited back to his old high school to speak. He hadn't been there in years. The hallways felt smaller, the classrooms unchanged. But the faces were different, brighter somehow, hungrier in the best way. During his talk, a student raised his hand and asked, "What would you say to the person who once told you to know your place?" Zeke didn't pause. "I'd say thank you," he replied, "because that was the day I started building my own." The auditorium erupted, not in cheers, but in something deeper, recognition. Because every single person in that room had felt small once. And here was proof that small didn't mean weak. It meant underestimated. It meant overlooked. And overlooked things, when sharpened, cut the deepest. After the talk, he walked the school grounds alone. Sat for a moment near the back staircase where, as a sophomore, he used to eat lunch by himself. He closed his eyes, listened, not to the ghosts of the past, but to the new sounds, laughter, footsteps, a younger generation reclaiming space. He once thought he had to survive alone. And then there was Lila. On the anniversary of the pool incident, they never called it the drowning, she posted a photo. Not of herself, not of the rescue, but of the notebook Zeke had once left her during one of Ramona's cleaning shifts. On the cover, "You are not your diagnosis. You are your direction." Her caption simply read, "Everything changed, not when I was pulled from the water, but when someone reminded me I was never meant to sink." That post went viral again. But it wasn't what it did online that mattered. It was what it stirred offline. Because suddenly, kids with disabilities across the world began sharing their moments, not of survival, but of defiance, of becoming. That was what Zeke, Lila, and Ramona had built, a chain reaction of people who stopped waiting to be saved and started learning how to architect freedom for themselves, not just once, but every day. Years from now, the name Zeke Moreno might not be in every textbook. There may not be statues or documentaries forever in rotation. The world moves fast and fame fades. But the lives he touched, the systems he rewired, the minds he awakened, those don't fade. They multiply. They ripple. And the real proof of his legacy won't be found in what people say about him, but in what people do because of him. Because this story was never just about one boy diving into a pool to save a disabled girl. That was the spark. But the fire that followed was lit by injustice, fueled by arrogance, and controlled carefully, surgically, by a young man who understood that rage, when refined, becomes strategy, that grief, when repurposed, becomes instruction, that silence, when intercepted, becomes signal, and that signal It travels farther than any headline ever will. Zeke taught a generation that power isn't only found in institutions. It can be coded in bedrooms, whispered in classrooms, drafted in journals. He showed the world that intelligence isn't defined by a last name or a trust fund, but by your ability to see clearly when others choose comfort. And when his enemies tried to make him small, to reduce him to the cleaning lady's son, the boy who broke the rules, the hacker kid, he refused, not with fury, but with design. He rewrote their narrative. And in doing so, he rewrote who gets to belong in the rooms where decisions are made. If you're watching this right now, ask yourself, who told you your place was limited? Who told you to wait your turn? To stay silent? To be grateful for crumbs? And what would happen if, instead of shrinking, you started building? One line of code, one question no one else asked, one refusal to accept the script. That's how it starts. Not with thunder, with intent, with whisper, with work. And Zeke's story, while extraordinary, is also entirely replicable. Not because everyone can do what he did, but because everyone has something they're meant to disrupt, something they're meant to outgrow. So no, this isn't the story of a boy who beat a billionaire. This is the story of what happens when the underestimated rise, when the silenced speak, when the broken systems finally crack under the weight of one person's unwillingness to disappear. Zeke never wanted revenge. He wanted a mirror. And he gave the world one. And now it's our turn to look into it and decide what we'll do next. Asterisk, real power doesn't come from money, fame, or inherited status. It comes from clarity, from refusal, from using your mind and voice even when the system demands silence. Zeke Moreno didn't just dismantle a corrupt empire. He taught us how to disrupt injustice by being precise, relentless, and unafraid to be underestimated. And in a world that still punishes truth-tellers, being underestimated might just be your greatest advantage.